Dakota sat at the kitchen table, staring at the half-empty cup of coffee in front of her. It was barely 7 in the morning, and exhaustion already weighed heavy on her shoulders. She glanced at her son, Lucas, as he struggled with the buttons on his jacket. He was only 7, too young to understand the depth of their loss, but old enough to feel it. "Come here, buddy," she said softly, kneeling to help him. His little hands trembled slightly, frustration clear in his big, expressive eyes. "I miss Dad," he mumbled, looking down. Her chest tightened, but she forced a smile. "Me too, sweetheart. Every day." It had been almost 8 months since the accident. One moment, her husband, Daniel, had kissed her goodbye on his way to the construction site. The next, she was getting a call that shattered her world. A fall, a freak accident, and just like that, the life they built together was gone. The first few months had been a blur: paperwork, insurance claims, sleepless nights, and endless tears. She barely remembered how she had managed to keep things together, but if it weren't for Daniel's parents, she wasn't sure she would have. Sarah and James had stepped in without hesitation. They picked Lucas up from school when work ran late, made him his favorite meals, and showered him with love. They never made her feel like a burden. They were family in every sense of the word. Her own parents, however, were another story. They had always made it clear that her older sister, Olivia, was their pride and joy. It had been that way since childhood. Olivia was the golden child, the one who could do no wrong. Dakota had spent her entire life trying to measure up, but nothing was ever enough. And now, history was repeating itself with Lucas. She saw it in the way her mother dismissed his endless questions, rolling her eyes when he got too curious. She saw it when her father barely acknowledged him, preferring Olivia's children, who sat glued to their tablets, perfectly silent and obedient. Lucas wasn't loud or rude. He was just a child who wanted to learn, to connect. But to her parents, he was an inconvenience. As she zipped up his jacket and kissed his forehead, Dakota reminded herself that she had to be enough for him. No matter what her parents thought, no matter how much they tried to make her feel like she and her son didn't belong, she would always put Lucas first. Dakota pulled into her parents' driveway, taking a deep breath before stepping out of the car. Lucas bounced excitedly in his seat, eager to see his grandparents. No matter how they treated him, he still loved them unconditionally. She wished she could shield him from the favoritism, but he was beginning to notice it himself. Inside, the house was just as it always was: neat, quiet, and filled with the faint scent of lavender. Olivia's kids sat in the living room, heads bowed over their phones, barely looking up as Dakota and Lucas entered. "Grandma, how does the clock work inside?" Lucas asked, pointing to the large antique clock in the hallway. His grandmother sighed, barely sparing him a glance. "Dakota, can't you get him to settle down? He always has so many questions." Dakota clenched her jaw. "He's just curious, Mom." "Olivia's kids don't ask so many questions," her father added, eyes still on his laptop. Dakota swallowed the lump in her throat and guided Lucas into the dining room, trying to ignore the sting. Dinner was tense from the start. Her parents were unusually chatty, asking about work, about Lucas, about everything. Dakota could feel they were leading up to something, but she didn't know what, until her mother set down her fork and asked, how much was Daniel's life insurance payout? The question hit like a slap. She nearly choked on her water, caught completely off guard. She hesitated, but the silence in the room was heavy with expectation. 300,000, she answered quietly. Her mother's fork clattered against her plate. Her father sat up, eyes widening slightly. "That's quite a sum," her mother said carefully. "What are you planning to do with all that money?" Dakota's fingers tightened around her napkin. "I invested it. It's for Lucas' future, his education, maybe a home when he's older." Her father waved a hand dismissively. "That's years away. You should think about the present, about your family." She stiffened. She knew that tone. It was the same one they used when Olivia needed help with her down payment, her lavish wedding. "You could do so much with that money now," her mother chimed in. "Help people who need it today, not save it all for some distant future." Dakota's stomach churned. "I'm not discussing this," she said, her voice firmer than she expected. The silence that followed was thick. Her father's expression darkened. Her mother pressed her lips into a thin line. It was the same look of disappointment she had grown up seeing. The rest of dinner passed in tense quiet, broken only by the sound of silverware against plates. As Dakota helped Lucas with his coat afterward, her mother touched her arm lightly. "Just think about it, sweetheart," she said softly. But Dakota already had. And for the first time, she wasn't going to bend. Dakota sat stiffly at the dining table, the warmth of her parents' home feeling colder than ever. The invitation had come unexpectedly, and given how the last dinner had gone, she had been hesitant to accept. But when her mother insisted, saying it was important, she gave in. Now, as she sat across from Olivia, she had a sinking feeling she had made a mistake. Dinner started normally enough. Small talk, forced laughter, a few passive-aggressive comments about how busy Dakota always seemed. But as the plates were cleared, Olivia cleared her throat dramatically and sat up straighter. "I've been thinking," she began, looking around the table as if she were about to make a noble sacrifice. "Mom and Dad have done so much for us. And times are tough right now. I think it's time we start giving back." Dakota's grip tightened around her glass. Olivia exhaled loudly, as if this was a great burden she was about to take on. "Jack and I have been struggling, but I'm going to send Mom and Dad $500 a month to help out. It's the least I can do." Dakota blinked. She knew Olivia and her husband had their fair share of expenses, but they were far from struggling. Her sister then turned to her with a tight, practiced smile. "And, Dakota, I was thinking since you're in a better financial position, you could send them $1,000 a month?" The words slammed into Dakota like a truck. She set her fork down slowly. "Excuse me?" "Well, it just makes sense," Olivia pressed on, her voice syrupy sweet. "You have a great job, and Lucas is your only responsibility. Plus, you have other income now." There it was. The unspoken truth behind Olivia's careful wording. The other income wasn't some bonus at work. It was the money she had received after Daniel's death. Dakota's stomach twisted. Her mother was already clapping her hands in delight. Her father beamed like it was Christmas morning. The pressure in the room was suffocating. She wanted to say no, to stand up and walk out. But the weight of their expectant stares, years of conditioning, and the desperate, foolish hope that maybe, just maybe, this would finally earn their approval held her in place. "Fine," she heard herself say. And just like that, $1,000 started leaving her account every month. At first, she told herself it was worth it. Maybe it would make them see her differently, appreciate her more. Maybe they would finally start treating Lucas like family. But reality sank in quickly. "Mom, could you pick up Lucas from school today? I have a late meeting." "Oh, honey, I'm so sorry," her mother's voice crackled through the phone. "I have such a headache today. You know how my migraines get." Excuses. Every time she needed them, they were too busy, too tired, too preoccupied. Meanwhile, Sarah and Jim never hesitated. And they never asked for a single penny. Dakota adjusted her coat against the bitter cold as she walked up to her parents' front door, a carefully wrapped bag of presents in her hand. The Christmas lights twinkled in the frosted windows, laughter and holiday music spilling from inside. It should have felt warm, familiar. Instead, something about it felt off. She had debated not coming at all. When her mother called a week ago, inviting her to an adults-only Christmas Eve dinner, she had hesitated. Just for this year, her mother had said in that overly sweet tone. "We want something more sophisticated. Wine. Elegant conversation. You understand, right? You can leave Lucas with Sarah and James. They'd love to have him." Something about it hadn't sat right, but Dakota convinced herself she was overthinking it. Maybe they truly wanted a quiet night. Maybe it wasn't personal. But as she stepped inside, the world seemed to tilt sideways. The house was packed, not just with adults, but with children. Olivia's 3 kids were running through the living room, shrieking as they chased each other with ribbons from opened gifts. By the Christmas tree, her cousin Linda's boys were helping themselves to cookies. More kids appeared in her line of sight, her cousin Mark's twins, Susan's teenager. Every child in the family was here. Every child except hers. The bag of presents in Dakota's hand felt suddenly heavy. She stood frozen in the doorway, her breath catching in her throat. Dakota, sweetheart. Her aunt rushed over, pulling her into a hug. Merry Christmas. Where's little Lucas? The question made Dakota's stomach twist painfully. Yeah, her cousin Peter added, frowning. Jake's been waiting to show him his new chemistry set. The chatter around her quieted, relatives looking at her with growing curiosity. Her mother appeared then, smiling like nothing was wrong. Dakota, come in. You're letting in the cold. Dakota barely heard her. Every cell in her body was screaming, demanding answers. Her feet carried her toward the kitchen, away from the curious eyes of family. Her mother followed, still acting as if everything was perfectly normal. You told me this was an adults-only party, Dakota said, her voice low and steady, though her hands trembled. You specifically told me not to bring Lucas. Her mother sighed, adjusting a Christmas-themed platter of cookies. Oh, Dakota, don't be so dramatic. Dramatic? The word felt like acid on her tongue. Mom, every single child in this family is here except mine.
Why?
Her mother pursed her lips, as if annoyed by the question. You know how Lucas is. He asks too many questions. He's intense. Dakota's breath hitched. Excuse me? The other children, her mother continued, gesturing toward the living room, they know how to behave. They don't disrupt conversations with endless curiosity. They understand their place. A sharp, disbelieving laugh escaped Dakota's lips. Their place? As if on cue, a loud commotion erupted from the dining room. Olivia's youngest, Kevin, had grabbed a handful of deviled eggs and was launching them at his sister. The eggs splattered across the table, staining Emily's velvet dress as she let out an ear-piercing shriek. Dakota turned back to her mother, raising an eyebrow. Yes, I can clearly see their superior manners. Her mother's face darkened. That's different. Boys will be boys. No, Dakota said, her voice filled with quiet fury. It's not different. You excluded my son because you wanted to hurt me. You wanted control. And you used my child to do it. Her mother scoffed. He's fine with Sarah and James. He doesn't even know he's missing anything. Dakota felt something inside her snap. She had spent her entire life trying to earn her parents' love, to be enough for them. But this was unforgivable. I'm leaving, she announced. Her mother waved a dismissive hand. Fine, but put your gifts under the tree first. We're opening them after dinner. Dakota stared at her for a long moment, then turned and walked straight to the front door, still clutching the bag of presents. As she reached for the handle, the murmurs in the room grew louder, family members looking on in confusion. Dakota? Olivia asked, her voice cautious. What's going on? Dakota turned, her heart pounding. I'll tell you what's going on, she said, her voice clear and strong. Mom told me this was an adults-only party. She specifically told me not to bring Lucas. And yet, every single one of your kids is here. A stunned silence filled the room. Whispers spread like wildfire. Olivia's husband, Jack, looked at his wife sharply. Wait, what? You told Dakota not to bring Lucas? Their father shifted uncomfortably, but their mother remained defiant. It wasn't personal. It was entirely personal, Dakota cut in. And I'm done pretending otherwise. Without another word, she turned and walked out, slamming the door behind her. The night air was freezing, but Dakota barely felt it. For the first time in her life, she wasn't trying to fit into a family that would never truly accept her. She had her own family, and they were waiting for her at home. The dining room was filled with the clinking of silverware and quiet murmurs of conversation. The smell of roasted turkey and spiced cider hung in the air, but Dakota barely tasted a thing. Her heart pounded in her chest as she looked around the table, taking in the familiar faces of her relatives. This was supposed to be a family Christmas dinner, yet all she felt was tension tightening around her like a noose. Her parents sat at the head of the table, their expressions smug, satisfied. Olivia sat beside them, smiling as if nothing had happened, as if she hadn't been a part of this entire charade. Dakota's fingers clenched around her napkin. Enough was enough. She pushed back her chair, the sudden noise drawing the attention of everyone in the room. Conversations trailed off, heads turned toward her, eyes blinking in confusion. "Several of you have been asking why I came alone tonight," she began, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. "Why Lucas isn't here celebrating Christmas with his family?" Her mother shifted uncomfortably. Her father cleared his throat. Olivia's face tightened. Dakota ignored them and continued. "I was told not to bring him. My parents called me last week and told me this was an adults-only gathering. No kids allowed. That's what they said." A murmur spread across the room. Her Aunt Caroline frowned. "But all the kids are here." Dakota let out a sharp laugh, though there was no humor in it. "Exactly. Every child in this family was welcomed. Except mine." The murmur turned into outright whispers. Confused glances were exchanged.
"What?"
Her Uncle Steve's voice cut through the growing noise. "You mean they?" "My son was the only one left out," Dakota confirmed, turning to her parents. "And when I asked why, Mom told me it was because he asks too many questions and doesn't know his place." Gasps rippled through the table. Her mother's face flushed deep red. "Dakota, this isn't the time." "Oh, I think it's the perfect time," Dakota cut in, her voice rising. "Because that's not even the worst of it." She turned to Olivia, who had gone pale. "For months, I've been sending our parents $1,000 a month to help them. And I did it because Olivia here stood up at dinner one night and said she was also contributing $500 a month, right, Olivia?" Olivia's breath hitched. Dakota turned her gaze to Olivia's husband, Jack, who was now staring at his wife with narrowed eyes. "But here's the thing, Jack. Olivia never actually sent them any money." Silence slammed over the room like a wave. Jack sat back in his chair, his face unreadable.
"What?"
Dakota folded her arms. "Mom and Dad asked Olivia to pretend she was sending money, so I'd feel obligated to contribute more. They lied. And so did she." Jack's jaw clenched. He turned to his wife. "Tell me that's not true." Olivia opened her mouth, but no words came out. The color drained from her face. Jack let out a sharp breath, shaking his head in disbelief. "Are you serious?" "We've been struggling, Olivia. I've been working overtime, trying to keep up with our bills. And you let me think we were helping your parents when you weren't sending them a dime?" I was going to tell you," Olivia stammered. Jack pushed back his chair.
"No."
"You weren't." The room erupted into chaos. "You scammed your own daughter?" Aunt Marie's voice rang out, full of outrage as she turned to Dakota's parents. "You manipulated her into giving you money while treating her son like an outcast?" Her father's face was tight with barely concealed anger, but her mother's expression wavered with panic as the weight of the family's judgment settled in. "That's disgusting," Uncle Mike muttered, throwing his napkin onto the table. "We're leaving." One by one, relatives began standing, gathering their things. Jack stood too, looking down at Olivia, who sat frozen in place. "I need to think about our marriage," he said flatly. "And I'm taking the kids to my parents' house for Christmas." "Jack, wait." Olivia reached for him, but he was already walking away. Her mother's voice trembled as she called after the leaving guests. "Please, let's not make this a big deal." "It was just not a big deal." Dakota snapped. "You used me. You lied to me. You made me feel like I owed you something, and all the while, you excluded my son from his own family." Her mother's lips trembled. "Dakota, we're family." "No," she said, her voice final. "Family doesn't do this." Without another word, she turned on her heel and walked out, feeling lighter than she had in years. The night Dakota walked out of her parents' house, she felt something shift inside her. It wasn't just anger or betrayal, it was clarity. For the first time, she saw her family for who they really were. Not loving, not supportive. Just people who took and took, expecting her to keep giving. She drove straight to Sarah and James's house, where Lucas was curled up on the couch, happily eating cookies with his grandparents. When he saw her, he grinned.
"Mom."
Look, Grandma let me decorate my own cookie. The warmth in his voice, the joy in his eyes, it was everything her parents had never given him. That night, after Lucas was asleep, she pulled out her phone, opened her banking app, and canceled the monthly transfers to her mother's account. A single click, and it was done. Then she blocked their numbers. The first few days of silence were blissful. No more guilt-tripping phone calls. No more manipulative messages. Just peace. But it didn't last. A week later, her phone rang from an unknown number. She knew who it was before she even picked up. Dakota. Her mother's voice was soft, too soft, like a rehearsed apology. "We miss you, sweetheart." "And Lucas, we made a mistake. We see that now." Dakota didn't answer. "We just want to make things right," her father added. "We were wrong about everything. We're so sorry." She almost laughed. They weren't sorry. They were just outcasts now. Their siblings and extended family had all turned their backs on them after Christmas. Olivia's marriage was on the rocks, and Jack had taken their kids to stay with his parents. The golden child had fallen, and suddenly, Dakota was their only option. "I appreciate the call," she said flatly. "But I have nothing else to say." Her mother's voice tightened. "Please, let's meet. We even got a special gift for Lucas, something we know he'll love." 2 days later, they showed up at her doorstep, clutching a large, beautifully wrapped box from an expensive electronics store. "Just let us give this to him," her mother pleaded, her eyes wet with carefully placed tears. "We want to be in his life." Dakota crossed her arms. "Where was this energy when you uninvited him from Christmas?" Her father sighed. "We made a mistake." "No," she interrupted. "You made a choice. And now you're facing the consequences." She didn't even bother opening the gift. "Lucas doesn't need this. He needs love. He needs family that actually cares about him. And you don't." Her mother gasped. "Were your parents?" Dakota shook her head.
No.
"Sarah and James are parents.
You?
You're just people I used to know." She closed the door, locking it without hesitation. For the first time in her life, she felt free. Because family wasn't about blood. It was about love, respect, and the people who showed up without asking for anything in return. The months that followed were some of the most peaceful Dakota had ever known. Without the constant pressure from her parents, she finally felt free. Free to focus on her son. Free to enjoy life without the weight of their expectations dragging her down. Lucas, too, seemed lighter. He no longer asked why his grandparents never wanted to spend time with him. He no longer felt like he had to compete for love. Instead, he thrived in the warmth of people who truly cared. Sarah and James continued to be his safe haven. They picked him up from school, listened to his endless questions, and encouraged his curiosity instead of shutting it down. At bedtime, James told him stories about the stars, and Sarah taught him how to bake cookies from scratch. One evening, as they sat around the dinner table, Lucas looked up from his plate with a big, innocent smile. "Grandma, can I have more mashed potatoes?" Sarah froze for a moment, her eyes widening in surprise before they filled with tears. James cleared his throat, pretending to be busy with his fork, but the emotion was clear on his face. Dakota blinked, her heart swelling. Lucas had always called them Mr. and Mrs. Johnson. But now, without hesitation, he had given them the title they had more than earned. Sarah wiped her eyes quickly and smiled. "Of course, sweetheart." From that day on, they were Grandma and Grandpa, and they wore the title with pride. Dakota soon realized they weren't alone. Aunt Caroline, Uncle Mike, and other relatives who had walked out of that disastrous Christmas dinner now made a real effort to include them. They were invited to barbecues, birthdays, and Sunday dinners. Lucas was treated like family, not out of obligation, but out of love. One summer afternoon, as he splashed in Uncle Mike's pool, he turned to Dakota and grinned. "Mom, why does the pool smell funny?" She opened her mouth to answer, but before she could, Uncle Mike jumped in. "That's chlorine, buddy. It keeps the water clean. Want to learn how it works?" Lucas' eyes lit up. "Yes." As Dakota watched her son listen intently, surrounded by people who truly cared, She felt something she hadn't in a long time: peace. She had spent years trying to earn love from the wrong people. But now she knew the truth. Family wasn't about blood. It was about love.